pronunciation of Hebrew, for example, was affected by the fact for a long time many Jews knew both languages. This was in antiquity. That influence has even reached to modern day Israeli Hebrew. There's a typical Hebrew pronunciation of the consonants B, K, and P, the letters Bet, Kaf, and Pei. Kaf is pronounced as K when it's not following a vowel, but it's pronounced as what linguists would call an X. That's the sound you find in the German composer's name, Bach. It's a sound made in the back of the throat with some friction. So you have pairs like he wrote in Hebrew is katav. In Israeli Hebrew and biblical Hebrew, it would have been katav, but it's pronounced, the initial K is pronounced K in katav, but in another form of the same verb, yichtov, he will write, that K becomes an X. And that's something that Hebrew borrowed from Aramaic a long time ago, and it's survived. And that has a lot to do with when two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic, are pretty close. They weren't mutually comprehensible, but when people are bilingual in two languages and they're very close, it's very easy for one item, one thing to slip from one language to the other and just become, it's called convergence in linguistics jargon terminology. Two languages, when spoken in a bilingual community, can come to resemble each other more and more. Now, even the Arabic language Quran shows the influence of Aramaic, as it contains a number of Aramaic loanwords, including perhaps the name Quran itself. Now, before anybody gets upset, it was Arabic scholars in the Middle Ages who opened this discussion. They noticed there were lots of foreign terms in the Quran. It wasn't just a Western imposition. Even the Hebrew alphabet we know today, the so-called square script, you see it in every Bible and every Israeli newspaper, it started out as an Aramaic script and the Jews borrowed it. Why they decided to abandon their original script is unknown, but it was undoubtedly due to the increasing dominance of Aramaic in the Near East, which we'll cover in some detail. Now, yes?
So first of all, I don't know if you plan to move your slides. We're still on the first one.
Oh no, it's
that's
no, it's correct.
It's correct. Okay.
Yeah, I sort of adopted this format as fewer slides, but a lot of information per slide.
The other thing that I have answered like a question, but I think you could give a little more comprehensive answer. Someone asked, what language did they speak in the Assyrian Empire?
Well, Assyrian, they spoke Assyrian. The Assyrian Empire, and there were older empires, but what's relevant to Aramaic is the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is the first millennium. It arose in the 7th century, approximately, and it has the famous names like Sennacherib was one of the Neo-Assyrian kings. And the Assyrians themselves, the dominant group, would have spoken Assyrian, which is the dialect of Akkadian. Their empire consists of many speakers of other languages, and Aramaic was one of them. Sennacherib attempted to conquer Jerusalem and Judea. He failed, so the Israelites were not absorbed into the Israelite Empire, but they did absorb all sorts of other languages into the Assyrian Empire, like Moabite, which is a language closely related to Hebrew, a little bit to the east of Judea, Ammonite, about which little is known. I don't know if the Assyrians got as far as the coast, where they would have absorbed Phoenician. I don't think they did. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think there is another question here. Did Aramaic emerge from cuneiform Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylon?
Standardization presupposed a supporting scribal culture with a trained group of scribes. Unfortunately, there's no trace in the textual record of how this situation developed. Already when Aramaic inscriptions appear on the scene, they are, if you will, they're already professionalized. Now, at about the same time, this is 8th and 9th century again, 9th and 8th century, we're going backwards. Similar things were happening in the southern area, south of this slide here, down here. this area is usually called Palestine, not in the current sense. It's a later Roman name that is used by scholars today. In the scholarly sense, it corresponds to the present day states of Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. So small city-states came into being, both Aramaic and non-Aramaic. The two kingdoms of ancient Israel and Samaria, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, also known as Judea. Also, there are Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites to the east of the River Jordan. And you also have the Philistines on the Mediterranean coast. The status of the Philistines, they were part of the Sea Peoples who brought about the end of the Bronze Age. I think it was the only identified group among the Sea Peoples. It's unclear that they were even Semitic. There's evidence that they may have been speakers of an Indo-European language originally. The most famous Philistine, of course, is Goliath. The Hebrew Bible makes them look really bad, the Philistines, that they were deadly enemies of the Israelites. But the most famous Philistine was Goliath, who was killed by David. But Goliath doesn't have a good Semitic etymology and has been convincingly compared to Hittite terms. So they may not even have been Semitic. Now, Phoenician studies are higher up the coast here, like Tripoli and Byblos. On the coast of present-day Lebanon, I should say, together with the Aramaeans up in Syria, over in Syria, all these, this is the immediate historical backdrop of the Old Testament, as you might know. Culturally, these places were all similar. There was an administration centered on a capital city with a temple and a palace combined with more tribal structures in the hinterland. They were ruled by dynastic monarchs, and they venerated a local national god as they protected the ruling dynasty. Now, I like this map quite a bit. It's a picture of the entire linguistic situation in the Middle East. It sort of collapses different time periods, so it's not entirely appropriate. But here you see what I was talking about. These are the Canaanite languages: Ammonite, Hebrew, Moabite, Edomite. Here's the Aramaic homeland up here. Eblite is really a kind of Akkadian. It's very old, so this had markers from different eras, but this indicates the overall structure of the Semitic languages. Arabic is down here. The size of the circles, I don't know if you can make it out, reflect the number of the population, but this map splits the Semitic area into three distinct areas. The area outlined in red is the central Semitic area, which in turn splits into Northwest. That's the Northwest on the map, which consists of the Aramaic languages and the Canaanite languages, including Hebrew. Further south is the Arabic member of the family. Now, the Eastern Aramaic is the Akkadian and Eblaite. That's a smaller area. Is Ale in Hebrew, would have been something similar in Aramaic. And correspondingly, the difference between Hebrew and Phoenician on the coast would then resemble that between Standard English and Scots English. Both Hebrew, well, that's not entirely true. I saw a movie made in Scottish dialect. What was it called? It's about drug addicts about 30 years ago. Train spotting. And I couldn't understand the Scots at all. It should have had subtitles, but they are considered mutually comprehensible. But so both Hebrew and Phoenician would have been mutually comprehensible, but not Aramaic would not have been comprehensible by the speakers of the other two. Now, these similarities are traditionally captured by a language tree view of the relationship, which is what you see on this slide. You can see it's from this, Hebrew and Phoenician are considered closer to each other than either is to Aramaic. You think of Aramaic occupies the uncle or the aunt relationship to Hebrew and Phoenician, if you consider the Canaanite family to be a sibling of the Aramaic family. And these others I won't discuss today. These others are siblings of the two. And so you go up the tree. As you go up the tree, you go farther back in time. Northwest Semitic would have been the ancestor of all of these. Northwest Semitic doesn't actually, we don't have any evidence for it. It's reconstructed by all the features that these lower languages in the tree have in common. And behind Northwest Semitic, you get to Central Semitic, which comprises all of these languages. And behind Central Semitic, you get to all of West Semitic, which includes these languages, and they're opposed to East Semitic, which only includes two, Eblaite and Akkadian. And at this point, we're back around the turn of the third millennium BC. And before that, you get to the ultimate ancestor, at least in the called Proto-Semitic by linguists. That's a technical term. It's based on all the similarities among these languages that we can reasonably project to having existed in the ancestral language. But this ancestral language is not attested. It's a theoretical construct, and there's constant ongoing argumentation about what belongs in Proto-Semitic and what doesn't. But anyway, that's the emergence of Aramaic. It's unknown when Aramaic originated as a separate language and what exactly the borders of its original territory were. Presumably, many aspects of the language took shape during the second millennium. At that time, and this was before the establishment of any city-states in Syria, it was the exclusively spoken, it must have been the exclusively spoken language of a nomadic population that did not yet have its own writing system, and therefore did not leave any textual traces. In Assyrian sources, Assyria was a literate culture back then in the second millennium. In Assyrian sources, however, from the century leading up to 1000 BCE, we find the term Aramaeans, i.e. the Aramaeans, which refers to various dispersed clans who occupied themselves with small-scale agriculture and pastoralism. They tended sheep and goats. They most likely also spoke various Aramaic dialects, but this is obviously merely a hypothesis. It is also unknown to what degree these dialects already resembled the Aramaic of the earliest inscriptions from the 9th and 8th century. In other words, the origins of Aramaic are quite obscure. Abraham, for example, may have been, when he lived in Mesopotamia, he may have been an Aramaic speaker, a speaker of an ancestor of Aramaic. We just don't know. Also unclear in this connection is what we do have some literary evidence, also unclear as to what to make of the historical significance of a few Bible passages that presuppose a familial relationship between the patriarchs of the people of Israel and the Aramaeans, such as the well-known description, which I mentioned in my Hebrew talk, describes Abraham as a, quote, wandering Aramean, Arami Oved in the Hebrew, a wandering Arab. What does that mean? The stories in Genesis, one thing about Abraham, he may have been Aramean. He certainly did wander. He moved. We don't know why he moved exactly. There's in the Bible, it says because God told him to, but maybe there was, there was a mega drought or something going on in Mesopotamia at the time. We just don't know. The other evidence, the stories in Genesis about Laban, the Aramaean, who was Jacob's father-in-law, Jacob the patriarch. There is no scholarly consensus on what the Israelites were thinking when they included things like this in the Bible. They probably reference folk memories that some of their relatives were Arameans, but we really just don't have any evidence on that. Now, as opposed to all that ethnological confusion, a murkiness, another interesting thing about Aramaic is that we can define the Aramaic language quite precisely based on grammatical features, which I'll give you some of them soon. But as I said, ethnologically, the Arameans are quite shadowy. And it's more than just linguistic here. We do not know what shared myths or legends, specific religious practices or customs and habits they may have had in this early Old Aramaic period, early first millennium. Currently available textual and archaeological evidence does not allow us to further flesh out the concept of Arameans as an ethnic concept compared to Israelites, Phoenicians, and others. If you recall, the Israelites gave us the Bible. They had lots of myths and legends. The Phoenicians, even though they were a commercial people, traders, and didn't produce any great literature that I'm aware of, they did in their funerary monuments. We do get a good picture of their religious beliefs and others. So for the Arameans, the major reason is the absence of creative religious, mythical, folk tales, or other cultural writings from this early period, or even later period. Also, basically, the Arameans did not produce a culture that has come down to us. Also, their conquest of their city-states by the Assyrians created a situation where there is no evidence for a shared ethnic or cultural Aramean identity after the 8th century BCE. Nobody really called themselves an Aramean after that conquest. How long that took, I don't know, but it just was, as a group, it kind of disappeared. It was absorbed into larger units. But the language took a different route. What the Aramaeans did have, in contrast to the relative lack of other cultural markers, is a new alphabet-based writing culture.
John, I have
Yes.
a question, a few
Yes.
questions here. First, and it kind of related to what you were saying, because the script that Arameans developed were from alphabetic. But the question was, how were, Beverly is asking, how were these languages communicated? I tried to answer it, but I think you would give more comprehensive.
Whatever their origin, it behooved them to learn Arabic, and they did, and over centuries. But the time frame is very unclear. It seems to have taken forever in Egypt, many centuries, of the population to switch over to Arabic, and they didn't do it completely. The Copts, which now constitute about 10% of the population, of course, the Egyptian government doesn't permit publication of statistics on that. They still use Copt in their sacred, in the religious ceremonies, but they have switched over to Arabic for the most part. But it did take many centuries. Unfortunately, very little is known about that. Hope I did.
John, can I just say something?
Yeah.
The most interesting aspect to me, Arabic language spreading. How did it spread to like Volga, Bulgars, and this mountainous area of Caucasus, right? And at one point, also Oleg, who was the Rurik, that Viking or Varangian that ruled Russia, he was looking for a new religion because they were pagans, and Arabic was the Muslim religion was presented to him as one of the religions he can choose, and he said, okay, what is the advantages of it? I said, well, you can't drink in our religion, so well, we can't pick it.
Yes, that's a famous story. It may well be true. He called all the contractors in and asked them to make their best pitch. He called in the Jews, the Christians, and the Arabs, and when he heard that the Arabs didn't allow alcohol, they lost. Well, that was anyway, I hope it's a complex map, but it does sacrifice the dimension of time to getting all the Semitic languages on it. But I like it because it gives you a very clear idea of the geographical spread. Anyway, any more questions?
No, that was it.
I
So
can't
please,
hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. By the way, anyone have a question? Please put it in the chat, and I'll read it. Okay.
Yeah, that's the best way to do it. Where was I? Now, as I said, all the peoples I mentioned that occur in the Bible, except for the Philistines, they all spoke very similar language. Now, the sounds, grammar, and vocabulary of the earliest texts in Old Aramaic, remember that's the 9th and 8th century, they already allow us to quite clearly distinguish Aramaic from these neighboring languages, including Hebrew, Phoenician, Moabite, and Ammonite. These four, by the way, they're all grouped together, as I should have mentioned earlier, they're all grouped together under the term Canaanite, which is derived from the term Canaan, which refers to this period, this area right here. The etymology of Canaan is quite unknown, but that's what the area is called. The first term that we have for Hebrew in the Bible, it's called the Safat Canaan, the language of Canaan. And it's the southern part of Syria, Palestine. Now you can see many systematic correspondences between Aramaic and these Canaanite languages. Let me go back here. Oops, went the wrong way. The systematic correspondences we do have suggest quite strongly that Aramaic and Canaanite developed from the same ancestor. This would be similar to the way English, German, Swedish, and other languages developed from the same Germanic language family. So very impressionistically, we could compare the difference between the Aramaic of Damascus in Syria which was an Aramaic-speaking city-state way back when. We could compare the difference between the Aramaic of Damascus and, for instance, the Hebrew of Jerusalem at that time. We could compare it to the difference between Standard English and Standard High German, because they probably, if you know English, you don't automatically understand High German. You can see the similarities, but you still have to learn it. What linguists, the Aramaic and Hebrew of that time would have been mutually incomprehensible, but obviously related, because so much of the vocabulary is shared. For one thing, the word for God is El in Hebrew, would have been something similar in Aramaic. And correspondingly, the difference between Hebrew and Phoenician on the coast would then resemble that between Standard English and Scots English. Both Hebrew, well, that's not entirely true. I saw a movie made in Scottish dialect. What was it called? About drug addicts about 30 years ago. Train Spotting. And I couldn't understand the Scots at all. It should have had subtitles, but they are considered mutually comprehensible. But so both Hebrew and Phoenician would have been mutually comprehensible, but not Aramaic would not have been comprehensible by the speakers of the other two. Now, these similarities are traditionally captured by a language tree view of the relationship, which is what you see on this slide. You can see it's from this Hebrew and Phoenician are considered closer to each other than either is to Aramaic. You think of Aramaic occupies the uncle or the aunt relationship to Hebrew and Phoenician, if you consider the Canaanite family to be a sibling of the Aramaic family. And these others I won't discuss today. These others are siblings of the two. And so you go up the tree. As you go up the tree, you go farther back in time. Northwest Semitic would have been the ancestor of all of these. Northwest Semitic doesn't actually, we don't have any evidence for it. It's reconstructed by all the features that these lower languages in the tree have in common. And behind Northwest Semitic, you get to Central Semitic, which comprises all of these languages. And behind Central Semitic, you get to all of West Semitic, which includes these languages, and they're opposed to aspects of what Jesus may have spoken. This would not have been something like Imperial Aramaic. Jesus was from Galilee, a district north of Jerusalem. He would have spoken a form of Aramaic that probably sounded odd and distinctive to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. How do we know this? Well, when Jesus had been arrested and was about to be crucified, we find the following passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 69 to 73. Quote, "Now Peter, he was the lead apostle, was sitting outside in the courtyard of the high priest, who was interrogating Jesus at the time. A servant girl came to him and said, 'You also were with Jesus the Galilean.' But he denied it before all of them, saying, 'I do not know what you are talking about.' When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, 'This man was with Jesus of Nazareth.' Again, he denied it with an oath, 'I do not know the man.' After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, 'Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you,'" end quote. Now, unfortunately, we don't know anything about the phonetic differences between Galilean Aramaic and the Aramaic of Jerusalem, but there was a difference, as the story indicates. And given the undoubted linguistic snobbishness of the people of Jerusalem, as their city was the center of the Jewish religion, that's where the temple was, and there was only one temple where sacrifice could be performed at the time. This was before Judaism Judaism is usually restricted to the period after the destruction of the second temple, the term, I mean. So the fact that Jesus spoke with a rustic hick accent was probably a big strike against him in the eyes of the people of Jerusalem. He spoke like an ignorant Galilean. So there are also Aramaic words found here and there in the New Testament. For example, Golgotha, place of the skull, that's where Jesus was crucified. That's an Aramaic word. It's an Aramaic form. That suffix THA is characteristically Aramaic. It's not found in Hebrew. And also there's another word, Akeldama, which translates as field of blood. And I believe that's where Judas was buried. And there's a gruesome story about, as retribution for his betrayal of Jesus. In one of the Gospels, his abdomen bursts open spontaneously. and he dies, and he gets buried in the Akeldama, field of blood. Now, and that final A in Dama is also an Aramaic suffix, not found in Hebrew. Now, another odd fact about these names is that the Greek text often identifies them as Hebraisti, the Greek name for Hebrew. This is largely, they're saying that what's actually Aramaic is Hebrew. They'll say it in the text. This is largely because Hebrew and Aramaic look a lot alike. The most prominent difference, as I said, Hebrew has a definite article, which is prefix, stuck on the front, and Aramaic shows a suffix with the same function. They were written with the same script in Judea, and were both important languages of Judaism. Plus, the New Testament was written for an international audience. That's one of the great developments in Christianity, as you're probably aware, is that originally Christianity was just another Jewish sect. Jesus of Nazareth thought of himself as a Jewish rabbi. The great Hungarian scholar Gezer of Hermes sort of established this 50 years ago. So for the audience, the New Testament was being written, the distinction between the two languages may have been irrelevant. So when we find Hebraisti in the New Testament, meaning Hebrew, introducing an Aramaic word, it may just have meant in the local language. But
John,
yes.
John, I have a question. So how well spread Greek language was in, let's say, Syria and Palestine?
Oh, I don't get into that, but evidently Greek is an interesting imperial language because it spreads so quickly, and it was established most firmly in Egypt, I believe, because it continued for many centuries. But the interesting feature about Greek is that it retreated completely after the expansion of Alexander all the way to Afghanistan, where they established Greek cities even. It retreated completely back to its homeland, which means it was never rooted very deeply. And it's usually assumed that Greek would have been known by the elites, but not too many people in the lower classes would have. They just stuck with their native languages. So it was rather in a rather fragile situation, except in Egypt. That seemed to have been strong.
But then Seleucid Empire, it was not the case. Right?
Excuse me, I didn't hear that.
Seleucid Empire,
yeah, up in Syria,
it was not the case.
After Alexander, his generals divided up his empire amongst themselves, and they named the portions of the empire after themselves. General Seleucus got Syria farther north, and the Ptolemies, named after Ptolemy, got Egypt, and there was the third one which escapes me.
But you're saying that the third one, Macedonia. But you're saying that in Seleucid Empire, even whatever left of her in Syria and Palestine, the Greek was not as
no. It retreated quickly. It's odd when you can compare it with Rome.
So
Rome was Latin survived the collapse of the Roman Empire on the left, and then the usual thinking is that the Roman practice of rewarding their armies with land in the provinces and causing them to relocate there may have had a lot to do with it. I don't know the details of how the Greeks handled how the Macedonians handled their empire, but I don't think they concentrated on building cities and didn't do much. It may just simply have been a lack of Greek. They didn't have the necessary amount of Greek speakers to sort of roll over the other languages.
So I just wanted to say that the fact that Gospels were written in Greek and would target that the audience were Greek is kind of like probably supporting the idea that was written more kind of towards the end of the first century AD, and they were not even interested to target Jewish or population at the time.
Yeah, Christianity became as a Jewish sect, one among several. Right. And then over the course of the centuries, you see a split coming. And by the end of the century, the amount of you can see the growth of anti-Semitism in the Gospels themselves. It just gets worse and worse, even though it was still the cross would be considered quite sacred. and they could easily have been left in Aramaic for exactly that reason. And it's quite possible, even probable, that no, there's two extremes here. You can take the Gospels literally in every respect. You have the problem of the internal inconsistencies because you have direct contradictions. On the other hand, you can say Christ is a figure created by somebody about 100 AD, and they wrote everything looking backwards. And would they really have written something as filled with inconsistencies as they did? As it's all very. I'm agnostic on the question, but.
John, we've been taking questions from the meetup, but we also have questions from YouTube, which is something new. But so there's this person, Jocelyn Torres, and I really can't make out the question, but let me read it. Camel was introduced in Canaan in the 10th century BC. The Aramaic alphabet is from the 20th century BC, which is, the letter Gimel and Gamel was named after the 10th BC, or something is wrong with that camel chronology. Something is wrong with this camel chronology.
Yeah, the camel was introduced late. They're right about that. We don't know when. It's in Phoenicia that I believe that the names of the letters were introduced, and that would have been after the 10th century BC. It would have been 8th or 9th. So it is consistent with the introduction of the camel to some extent, but no, it is true the camel, they rode mules or donkeys around in the patriarchal age, and the book of Genesis, there aren't any camels. That is true. But Gimel is generally related to camel, that's true.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
But those names may be fairly young. They first show up in the Phoenician period, I believe, which is in beginning of the first millennium.
Right. So this was always kind of like haunting me, as a Jew. When my father died, I read the famous, a prayer Kaddish, in honor of my father, and then they told me that's not in Hebrew, that's in Aramaic.
Yes.
So a lot of it, I speak a little bit of Hebrew, so a lot of it didn't make sense to me. It was hard kind of to memorize, and if there was a 40 rabbis, they will read it in four different ways. It's they say ishkadar, idkadar, like you say it, and then they'll say, oh, you don't say ishkadar, you say wishkadar, like they would.
Yeah.
These sounds are so different from, like, if you go to Moroccan, which is the Sephardic Jewish wave, they say it one way. Then Ashkenazi, they say Eid Kadal, so it's
Yeah.
So I had a hard difficulty, not learning it. I mean, obviously it's all there. There's a million videos and you can kind of learn it and say it. But whenever you say a word incorrectly, obviously, religiously people say, oh, your father's soul doesn't ascend far high enough. So in Hebrew, I mean, in a lot of the prayers, Jewish prayers, there's a combination of the Aramaic and Hebrew.
That's true. That's true of Chad Gadya too. I read it before this talk, and there's a lot of Hebrew in there. It's not completely in Aramaic, so that just shows people are highly bilingual and can switch back and forth at will, which they do. Begin one sentence in Hebrew and finish it in Aramaic.
So to me, it's interesting that one of the aspects. Okay, so they interpret it in so different ways. So the fact that Aramaic has also had been spoken language for so long, a lot of the sounds must have gone, because like I said, 40 rabbis interpreted different 40 ways, and it's the sounds are so much different, and it makes like religiously, I'm not as religious. It makes people like tick when you don't say the correct way.
Yeah, well, some people are quite sticklers for accurate, correct language.
So another question I have, though, the Cyrus cylinder and Ashurbanipal library, what was the percentage of Semitic, Aramaic, and maybe even Hebrew writing? I don't know. What would you say, like whatever survived? Like, for example, Cyrus cylinder, was it all written in Aramaic, Was it not? I mean, how did,
Actually, I don't know, to tell you the truth. I know about the Cyrus cylinder. I've never read it though, so
I see. Okay,
I don't know what it's written.
what about the famous, you know,
I think,
eye
I
for
think,
an eye, and you know,
excuse me?
eye for an eye, what's his name? The laws of Hammurabi. Uh,
That's in Akkadian,
I can't even got it.
in
Okay.
Babylonian. There was a later Assyrian. Babylonian and Akkadian are two different dialects. They were mutually comprehensible. They aren't very different, but they not too much Aramaic literature outside of the Syriac outside of the Christian churches of the East, the Orthodox churches, the Assyrian church, the Melkites, the Jacobites, all of that, which produced a ton of religious literature in Aramaic, a ton, which I haven't gone into today because we'd be here for another 2 hours. And the Jewish use of Aramaic, as I alluded to, the use in the Midrashim and the Talmuds, particularly the Babylonian Talmud, there's a lot of Aramaic that shows up. What you don't have anywhere in Aramaic is very much creative literature, where they tell a story, as in the Bible. You do have something called the Tale of Achika, which was apparently written in Aramaic, but that's the only real work of literature that I'm really aware of. There are also, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a fair amount of Aramaic, which I have looked at. And what they would do is the most famous Aramaic composition is the Genesis Apocryphon, which is sort of an elaboration of the tales in the patriarchal tales in Aramaic, and it just provides a lot more detail about, imagined detail about what was going on. And they provide a famous description of how beautiful Sarah was, which is not in the Bible, but it is in this Dead Sea Scroll written in Aramaic called the Genesis Apocryphon. And it's apocryphal because it's, something added to the Bible, but it's in Aramaic. But it never, whatever, they did have a little bit of literature, but none of it really, got any really didn't get out of the Aramaic community to any great extent. Unlike Hebrew, which became, the Old Testament became the most important book in the Western world. But anyway, I have one more, I promise, one more thing. I just want to talk about, before closing, I'd like to talk about the impact of Aramaic on Arabic. Now, as we've said, we've talked about the impact of Aramaic on Syria, Palestine, the Assyrian Empire, Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, and Judea. So it had impacts in other places, but I don't have time. So Aramaic also had a big impact on Arabic. The Arabian Peninsula lies beyond the area where Aramaic spread as a naturally spoken language. Yet the history of Aramaic is inextricably linked to Arabia, since in Achaemenid times, Imperial Aramaic was introduced into Arabia as a means of formal expression for law and probably also administration. This then developed into what is called Nabatean Aramaic. The Nabatean Empire was founded in the 4th century